Hi, I'm Karim Lasri, and in this talk we will take a usage-based perspective on probing, looking closer at grammatical number and its usage by a neural language model on the number agreement task. We propose a novel methodology aimed at searching for encodings of linguistic properties that are used by a neural language model, thus adopting a usage-based perspective on probing. In brief, we first find linear encodings of grammatical number that are used by BERT on the number agreement task. We further find that these encodings are orthogonal for nouns and verbs. Finally, we are able to identify the layers in which information about grammatical number is passed from a noun to its head verb for the model to make the correct prediction on the number agreement task. So throughout our experiment, our goal is to find encodings which are used by the model. Generally speaking, encodings of a property in a model's layers can be spurious in the sense that they make it possible to extract information from layers, but they have no effect over the model's predictions, or they can be what we termed functional encodings, which are in fact used by the model when trying to solve a task requiring the property. We therefore take a usage-based perspective on probing for linguistic properties, under which we first look for encodings that are functional, and then we investigate how information flows in the model when it is making a prediction requiring knowledge about the probed property. So in previous research, a number of paradigms have been proposed to investigate the capture of linguistic property by a neural language model. We taxonomize probing methods into the following three categories. First, diagnostic probing consists in training supervised classifiers on top of a model's intermediate representations to predict a linguistic property and estimate whether the property is present in layers. Such method, however, is agnostic regarding whether the encoding is actually used and might find encodings that are only spurious. Second, behavioral probing consists in the model's prediction on a test set designed to evaluate the model's capture of targeted linguistic knowledge. While directly observing the model's behavior, such tests usually treat the model as a black box, being agnostic on how the model solves the task. Finally, causal probing methods make a causal claim about how components of the model interact with each other causally, usually with the model's output. In this work, we draw from the three methodologies above to show how encodings of a property are used by a neural model and how information about that property is passed in layers. So under our user-based perspective, we first need a behavioral task requiring the property to investigate whether a given encoding is in fact used. The model under considerations needs to perform well on the task, otherwise we can't test whether a given encoding is useful to produce correct predictions. The choice of property and task is thus codependent. We further need a causal intervention to assess that the encoding of a property is functional and not spurious, investigating whether the encoding has a causal effect over the model's predictions. If we erase an encoding that is functional, the causal intervention should harm performance on the behavioral task as it requires knowledge about our property. So let me present our behavioral task. We choose subject-verb number agreement as it is a well-studied task on which our analyzed model, BERT, has been shown to perform well. So what is number agreement? In English, a verb agrees in number with its subject. We will call the verb the target of the agreement and the subject the cue. A model succeeds on this task if it assigns a higher probability to the right verb form. This task is usually used to assess whether a model captures syntactic dependencies between the cue and the target. We, in turn, will only use this task to see if we can find functional encodings of grammatical number and to see how information about this property is passed across layers from the cue to the target of the agreement. So to find a functional encoding, we first need information to be present in the model's layers. Indeed, for information to be used by the model, it first needs to be extractable. So we estimate extractable information using V information between R, the representations variable, and N, the number label variable, expressed as mutual information but using V entropies. The V entropies are just defined as usual entropies, but under a given variational family. In this work, as our variational family V, we will use a family of linear diagnostic probes, here logistic regressions. Next, as our goal is to go from encoding to usage, we need a procedure to intervene on representations and prevent the model from using a given encoding and determine if it is functional. We make use of amnesic probing proposed by Lazar and his colleagues, and using the learned parameters of a diagnostic probe, we compute a projector onto the null space of our probe, removing the subspace that our classifier uses. We iterate this process until no more information can be extracted, obtaining a set of representations from which the encoding has been removed. If the encoding is functional, this intervention should harm performance on the behavioral task. So now that we have a task and a procedure to find functional encodings of a grammatical number, we take a closer look at the representations we will intervene on. Throughout our experiments, we don't know a priori if BERT has a shared functional encoding of number across part of speech that is shared for nouns and verbs. We verify whether the encodings are distinct, so we look for functional encodings on different sets of representations for nouns and verbs. We also look for functional encodings on a mixed set to test whether the functional encoding might be shared. As verbs are masked when performing the number agreement task, we also consider a separate set of masked verb representations to find our functional encodings. So this leaves us with 4 categories of representations in our experiments: nouns, verbs, mixed, and masked verbs. Throughout our experiments, we try to answer 2 questions. The first one is, how is number encoded in layer? So we take a look at extractable information first, then we look for functional encodings by removing the properties from our layers, and third, we check if functional encodings are shared or not across part of speech. Our second question is, how is number information transferred across positions? So we first analyze where our functional encodings remove or harms performance, and then we perform attention pruning to further investigate how this number information is transferred. So we first take a look at the extractability of information using a linear diagnostic probe. The x-axis in this figure represents the probed layer, and each color one of our 4 probed set of representations. We first find that linear information about a number is almost perfectly extractable from both nouns and verbs in all layers, as the blue and the orange curves show. We find that it is also possible to extract information linearly from a mixed set of representations, suggesting that the encoding might be shared. Finally, the masked verbs acquire information in the first 7 layers. Then we also use our linear classifiers to see whether they point at encodings being shared or not across categories. To do so, we measure the cosine similarity of our learned parameters across categories, where each matrix here represents this similarity for 2 categories among verbs, nouns, and masked verbs. The rows and columns represent the layers on which our diagnostic probe has been trained on. On the left, we first observe that encodings of nouns and verbs seem to be slightly opposite. And on the right, we observe that encodings of nouns and masked verbs seem to be orthogonal. However, this is only the diagnostic of linear probes, so we don't know if the encoding is spurious or functional. We then move on to applying our amnesic interventions to search for functional encodings. So we learned amnesic projectors on each of our 4 sets of representations and for each layer. We then intervene on representations at both the cue's position and the target's position. In this figure on the right, we represent the intervention at the target's position, where the intervened layer is represented in the y-axis. Now let me break down this plot. When intervening on layer 0, we measure information loss at layer 0. No information is lost, as no information was present to begin with. We then measure the information lost in the subsequent layers. No information roughly is lost when erasing number at the non-contextual layer of masked verbs. We then measure the accuracy drop on our behavior task, the number agreement task, to see if this intervention caused harm to the model successes on the task. When intervening on the subsequent layers, we start to see information lost on the layer where we intervene, but this information is recovered from the context in the subsequent layers. Still, no decrease is observed on our behavioral task as information has been recovered. For the first 8 layers, we observe the same pattern. Finally, in the last layers, we start to see an irreversible loss, meaning the target stops receiving information from its context. The intervention in turn harms the performance on the task using our masked verbs amnesic probe at the target's position. We perform a similar analysis by erasing number information at the cue's position, still measuring information loss and task performance decrease at the target's position. We find strong alignment between information loss in layer and performance drop on the number agreement task. This means we found functional encodings in layers actually used by the model to solve the task. Expectedly, at the behavior level, the amnesic projector learned on nouns affect the cue, and the projector learned on masked verbs affects the target, but the opposite is not true, which means that the functional encodings are not shared across part of speech. We also find a consistent alignment across positions, which means that information is passed from the cue to the target at a specific layer, which is layer 9. So we further investigate how this information is passed using attention head pruning, first cutting direct attention from the target to the cue, or cutting attention from all tokens to the cue to know if information is passed through intermediate tokens. For each matrix, the row represents the first intervened layer and the column the last intervened layer. Cutting direct attention has little effect over performance, while cutting all attention to the cue makes performance decrease close to chance level. This suggests that information is passed through intermediate tokens on the task. The minimal range of layers yielding maximal decrease is 2 to 8 on the right matrix, suggesting that this transfer occurs in these layers consistently with previous observations. So we conclude that using our methodology, we have been able to find linear functional encodings of grammatical number that account for the most successes on number agreement. We have seen that these encodings are not shared across parts of speech, even if a linear probe can extract information from a mixed set of representations, and these encodings are rather orthogonal, which is surprising from a linguistic point of view, as number is a unique category that is common to both parts of speech. We have identified the layers in which information transfer occurs across position, and we see that this transfer occurs between layers 2 and 9. Finally, we have been able to show that information is mostly passed through intermediate tokens. We believe that with this analysis, we bridge the gap between information encoded layers and the actual behavior of the model. Thank you very much for listening.